once again to the upper room. It's great to be with you. And you may be hearing some geese, in the audio version of our background. And we'll get to that. That's actually very important today. But for now, we're going to get started in a way that we don't typically start into our lesson. By the way, we'll be in Matthew 6 again. And if you'll turn there, we'll get to that eventually. Normally, we like to start a little light. If you've had a kind of a difficult, heavy week, that we start a little bit light, so, kind of ease our way into a lesson. Today, we're going to do just the opposite. We're going to start kind of heavy, all right? You might remember David Letterman. He was the star of his own show, late night show. He was a comedian. And one thing that made him famous, or his show famous, was what he called his top 10. And a lot of people then began to do top 10 lists. We're going to start today with a top 10 list. It's going to be my top 10 list. And here's what it is. It's my top 10 list of things for us to be worried about. All right. So again, it's going to be a little heavy because anything we worry about is not light. Let's jump into it. They're really not in any specific order. We'll try not to spend too much time on them because this lesson isn't about these issues. They're just going to propel us to the place where we can say, okay, what do we do with such things? Here we go. The very first thing that comes to my mind that most of you probably realize is that we are as close to nuclear war as we have been since 1962. You might recall, if you're old enough, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union got so close to us with nuclear warheads. I remember hearing, anyway, of drills that would take place in public schools where kids would get under their desks in case there's a nuclear war starting. And I always wondered, does really getting under your desk help you with a nuclear war? But we really are as close as we've ever been to that kind of a situation as we fight this proxy war with Russia and keep pushing Putin further and further. Everybody agrees that Putin's a madman, but a madman with 5,000 nuclear warheads, you want to be a little careful of that, and he's already made mention of this. And so our leaders seem to be okay with that, with kind of pushing him to the brink. And so we really are as close to nuclear war as we've ever been. The second item on our top 10 list of things to worry about, I'm going to say, is the attack on our food supply chain. I don't know if you're aware that that's happening now, but certainly by the destruction of companies and factories that help produce food, by the diesel shortage and the high prices of such things. Yeah, to that the kind of the maniac Bill Gates and his purchase of 250,000 acres of farmland, along with China coming in and getting their fair share, that there is something in the works here regarding our food supply chain. And again, any of these we could go deeply into, but we're not going to. I just want to give you another thing to be concerned about. Third on our list is how many millions of people who've had their lives destroyed by the mandates, the vaccine mandates. And when I say their lives destroyed, I'm saying so many people have lost their jobs, their occupations, their livelihood. Add to that the now obvious dangers of those vaccines. And so now we have things going on around us that really make you kind of scratch your head. You probably heard of sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. Now we have a new acronym, and that is SADS, sudden adult death syndrome, being connected to the vaccines. I hate to tell you that, but instead of going into many stories, I refer you to a website. And that website is called Died Suddenly, and then there's a / unwanted effects. And make sure you set aside 2 or 3 hours to get to the end of that list of people who are just dropping dead unexpectedly. And for the most part, it's younger people. Many athletes, many in the military, many police officers, healthcare workers, people who were required to have that vaccine. And so, that becomes another thing that we could be concerned about and distraught over. Kind of attached to that last one is something relatable, and that is the sudden death of 18 to 64-year-olds is up 40%, according to a CEO of a major insurance company. 40% increase. And you got to remember, these insurance companies keep track of this kind of thing, and they have for literally decades and decades and decades, and they've seen a 40% increase. That has never been seen before in our country. There might be a 2%, 5% increase, but now they see a 40% increase. What is it that is causing people to suddenly, and young people again, to have heart problems, strokes, that kind of thing? Number 5 on our list leads us to the fact that the last 7 months we have had 8+% inflation in our culture, the economy, which results in not just higher prices for things like meat and bread and eggs, as you've seen that, and we all can deal with that. But in reality, trillions of dollars have been lost in retirement funds. These are funds that millions of people have relied upon toward the end of their lives, and we've talked to some of those people, and they are fairly distraught over the fact that they are watching their retirement disappear before their very eyes. You talk about something that concerns them, worries them, that is it for sure. Number 6 on my list is enemies of the state are being arrested every day. What do I mean by enemies of the state? Well, the state now, the deep state, those in control of our culture and in control of our country, they are now making no bones about the fact that if you are an enemy of theirs, if you're not on the right side of the aisle, the right side of politics, the right side of worldview, they're coming after you, and that certainly includes you and me, for the most part, because we probably don't agree on some of the crazy ideas that are being fed into our country. So if you oppose that, you're an enemy of the state, and those people are now being arrested and put in jail for no other reason than that they are enemies of the state. And certainly that harkens back to the years of the Nazis in Germany and any fascist movement, certainly Marxism. It's the trademark of Marxism to go after those who they consider enemies, who don't agree with them. And since we believe in God, and we believe that God is the central focus of all of our lives, we are now automatically enemies of the state, as it stands now. Number 7 on our list is the fact that and I'll tell you who they are coming for your children and grandchildren. The UN has had programs for years, and they're really Marxist related, but that is to destroy the family as God intended it. And so to do that, they're literally coming after our kids. They're doing it through the media and big corporations, and certainly through the government schools. You certainly can see this happening before your very eyes. As children in the schools as young as age 5 are being encouraged to question whether or not they are a boy or a girl. Could you have ever dreamed of this when we were kids? But they're coming after them. A little levity here. I've referred to Babylon Bee before. It's a satirical website, and they have great articles that kind of make fun of some of the things going on in our culture, and they spare no one. Let me read to you what they've said about this. Interest in Drag Queen Story Hour has declined drastically across the country after several libraries chose to more accurately name them Man Wearing Lingerie Wants to Spend Time with Your Kids Hour. Okay, if you don't laugh about it, you'll cry about it. Okay, let's move on to number 8, and this is simply UFO sightings. Unidentified flying objects in the sky, and these sightings are now up to 3,000 to 4,000 people a year. It's not just those folks that run the carnivals that are seeing these unidentified flying objects. These are reputable people in the armed forces who are flying at night and seeing these. What's going on with all the unidentified objects in the sky and people's descriptions of them, and they increase, it seems, day by day. Number 9 is a most recent development this week. Boston University has now completed their work to find a virus that is 80% lethal, okay? And this virus is a combination of the last 2 viruses that were part of the pandemic. What they've done is they've taken the Omicron variant, taken a spike from that, and added it to the Wuhan virus, and now they believe it's 80% lethal. So that's good news. That's something to look forward to for sure. And let's end with the fact that this ongoing list, number 10 for me, the ongoing list of foods that cause cancer seems to be growing. Let me give you the list that they now have for these foods that we consume all the time that they believe are causing cancer. Processed foods, fried foods, overcooked foods, dairy, refined sugar, flour, alcohol. Okay, except for that last one, that's my entire diet. So my entire diet causes cancer. But it seems that no matter what you consume, it will bring disaster to your health. Okay, discussion question real quick. First one of the day. What did I leave out? What things are happening, and it could be in your own personal life. I can't even touch on those, of course. But what things are happening that worry you, that bring anxiety to everybody, really, that we know? What did I leave out? Okay, I didn't even mention the things that they want us to be worried about, like climate change. It used to be global warming, but since, that didn't really pan out, they've changed it to climate change. We should be worried about that. And of course, the fact that we're not able to abort as many babies as we used to is a real concern for most people, apparently, from the media. So those things are happening. And of course, there's Alzheimer's, that many of us will lose the ability to remember anything. And some good news, though, if all this bad news is overwhelming you, the good news is they found that Viagra might counteract that. So all you Viagra fans, there's hope. Okay, where are we at? Let's review. Last week, we're in the Sermon on the Mount, of course, the lucky ones. You're not feeling so lucky today, are you? But I doubt if people in general are feeling lucky in our culture. We're in this series on the Sermon on the Mount, and last week Jesus talked about what we value. Remember that? We called it price tags. And don't think that what he talked about in the lesson last week is disconnected, unrelated to what he's going to talk about now. In fact, they are very much connected. Last lesson was about what we value and how we need to be careful not to store up those things we value for ourselves. And now he stays with that theme, but kind of turns the tables on what is valuable, okay? And we'll get to that, but the real point is this. We worry about the things that are valuable. In other words, our fate is fixed. If we're going to invest our entire lives, our focus, our fixations on the things of this earth, on money and material possessions and things like that, then our fate is fixed, that the next natural thing Jesus says will happen is that you'll become an anxious person. You can't not become an anxious person. So now Jesus goes into an area I want to call every man's sin. All right? And every man's sin. There's a lot of sins for us to choose from, right? Sexual immorality, including that would be fornication and adultery. There's certainly greed and murder. There's all kinds of choices when you want to sin. I'm going to call this one, though, every man's sin, because worry and anxiety seems to touch every single person I know. Maybe a close second would be lying, maybe. But I know a lot of people who are just honest to the core. They'll never lie, but they worry like crazy. Okay, so that's where he's going now, and see how they're connected. It's connected back to, if you're going to make your life about what you see, touch, feel, hold on to, store up, you inevitably, your fate is fixed. You'll inevitably become an anxious person. And I've done my very best to get you to that place this morning in this lesson that we're taping. One of the other reasons I call this every man's sin is that Jesus now will spend more time on this topic than any other topic in the Sermon on the Mount. It's certainly as though Jesus understands, and he does, and knows that of all the things that will cause issues in our lives, this sin, and it is a sin since Jesus says not to do it, this sin is one that we accept as a normal way of life. And so he's going to spend a lot of time on it and address it. We'll cover most of what he says about it today and then finish it up in the next lesson. So here we go, Matthew chapter 6, verse 25, if you'll join me there. Therefore, Jesus says, what's therefore there? For, what he's about to say links back to what he just said. So therefore, I tell you, do not worry. All right, 3 words. Not difficult to understand, not complicated, very simple. A command from Jesus: do not worry about your life, what you'll eat, what you'll drink, about your body, what you'll wear. And then he asks this question: is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? In other words, isn't there more to life than what you see, your appearance? Obviously, with Jesus, this is a rhetorical question, right? Of course there's more to life. But we tend to forget there is. I kind of wonder if Jesus might be thinking of the proverb in Proverbs 11:22, like a gold ring in a pig's snout is a beautiful woman who shows no discretion. What's the point of being a beautiful woman or an attractive man, putting all that work into your appearance, if you have no discretion, you have no wisdom? You might as well put a beautiful gold ring in the snout of a pig, is what you might be thinking. I don't know. The first thing I need to mention is that his list is not our list. I don't know anybody who really worries whether they'll have food to eat today. There are people in the world that do, but amongst us, that's not on our list. It's not on our top 10. I gave you a top 10. It's not on our top 10, is it? We're not really worried whether we have clothes. My greater concern is, how can I fit all those clothes in that closet? I need a bigger closet, bigger barns. Okay, so his list is not our list. So let's look then, not at the list, but let's look at exactly what he's saying. What is this thing we call worry? Jesus uses a word, and the Greek word there is really important. The Greek word is merimnao. Merimnao literally means pulled apart, to go to pieces, distracted, choked, to divide the mind. Now think about that. When he says worry, what are the odds that you're being pulled apart? Your mind is divided. You're distracted. Well, there's a great chance, he says, that as you live this life, that's going to happen to you. James, his brother, wrote about this and referred to it anyway in chapter 1, verse 5. I'm going to read from the Message. If you don't know what you're doing, pray to the Father. He loves to help. You'll get his help and won't be condescended to when you ask for it. Ask boldly, believingly, without a second thought. In other words, don't be distracted from asking God for what you need. Don't need to have a second thought about it. People who worry their prayers, and it's in quotations, people who worry their prayers. Does that ever happen to you? Do you spend most of your time talking to God about the things you were worried about? People who worry their prayers are like wind-whipped waves. Don't think you're going to get anything from the Master that way. Adrift at sea, keeping all your options open. In your translation, it says being double-minded. The word is actually double-souled. Your very soul is divided and pulled apart, and you come to God and you're just bringing your worries to him. There is a place in 1 Peter where he tells us to cast our worries on him. But if all I'm doing in my prayer life, James says, is thinking about the things I'm worried about, then I'm not really trusting God with anything, and I'm double-minded. I'm distracted is the word, and that's the picture that God gives us here. A distracted mind, a distracted life. So that Greek word talks about those ideas of being pulled apart and distracted. And actually, the word worry in the English is from the German würgen, which means to choke or strangle. Okay, so you get the idea. This kind of life will literally choke the life out of us. We're going to demonstrate that in just a moment. But it sure conjures up the idea of the parable Jesus told about the 4 soils. Do you remember that? With the 4 soils, he says the farmer throws his seed, and he tells us later the seed is the word of God. God is that farmer, and he throws those seeds on 4 types of soil. One is hard pan. If you see my location here, this is hard pan. It's just hard. It's like asphalt. The other one has rocks in it that prevent the seed from getting depth and growing up as a plant. The 3rd soil Jesus talks about is one that has thorns and weeds in it that when the plant grows up, it chokes out that plant. And then finally, fertile soil, which is what farmers need for productive and successful crops. Okay, but it is that 3rd soil that worry comes into play. And Jesus says this exactly when he's describing or explaining this parable. And so for that description, I take you to Luke 8:14, where Jesus says, "The seed that fell among the thorns stands for those who hear, but as they go on their way, they are choked by life's worries." He makes no bones about it. He goes on to say, it's also the riches and pleasures that we seek, which connects us back to what he just talked about in Matthew 6. And he says, and they do not mature. They die. They don't keep growing. Literally what Jesus is saying in this brilliant parable, simple story, but brilliant parable, is that the worries of life, the things that distract us, the things that that pull us apart, those things will choke the life out of us and any potential for God's word and the ideas of God's kingdom to come to fruition in our lives. This is a big deal, a big deal. That's why he spends so much time on this one idea of worry. He knows that it touches all of us, and he also knows that it can literally stunt our growth in the kingdom of God. And as we'll see in a little bit, it actually destroys our connection with God himself. I want to say one more time that if our minds are fixated on accumulating and storing up riches for ourselves, pleasures, that kind of thing, our fate is fixed. We will live a life of anxiety. I grew up with a father who was a very anxious guy. He had an ulcer that came from his anxieties. He was a wonderful man, a fun man. In the depths of his heart, there was a lot he was so worried about. And sometimes I wonder if it's almost genetic, if that gets passed down. But most of all, it is a choice that we make. You're probably familiar with the time Jesus visited the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus in Bethany, which was a village just outside of Jerusalem. I pick it up in Luke chapter 10. Here we go. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened up her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was, here's the word, distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." Okay, what is happening? Her anxiousness, and Jesus is going to actually address her anxiousness and worry. Her anxiousness and worry and distraction has brought her to a boiling point to where now blame comes out of her. And not just blame towards anyone, blame towards Jesus. Why aren't you solving this problem? See, that's an ugly side or ugly result of our anxiousness, is that we can even turn to God and go, why aren't you solving this problem? Jesus responds to her in verse 41, "Martha, Martha, Martha, Martha." He actually just says it twice, but since I'm a big Brady Bunch fan, "Martha, Martha, Martha." The Lord answered, "You are worried." What's the word there? It's the word we talked about before, merimnao. You are coming apart, falling apart at the seams. You're being choked. You are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. In other words, you want me to take away her opportunity to sit at the Son of God's feet? She's chosen the one thing y'all should choose, to be with me. So what can we learn from Martha's little predicament, her little tirade, if you will? 3 things real quick. Kind of just take notes on this. We won't go into any depth. Number 1, we should have realistic expectations about life and certainly about God. Jesus is not there for a buffet. Jesus is there to be with whomever wants to be with him. The second thing we can learn from this is the refusal to play God. Really, what Martha is doing is, let me play your role. I'm now the 4th person in the Trinity, and I will play your role and tell you the way things ought to be. We actually, when we're anxious and worried, oftentimes are wanting to play God. The third thing we can learn from this little predicament she's in is to remember that God's character is that he is good and he is always good. And Martha's kind of doubting that goodness. If you're really good, you would Do you hear that today? We hear it all the time. If God was really a good God, he would. Martha's doing the same thing. And what does Jesus do in response to her? He doesn't say, I know, I wish I was better. I know. Your sister should be doing what's more important. He does not give her an inch, does he? He says, Martha, cut it out. This is destroying you. What he says to Martha is what he already said in the Sermon on the Mount. So there's just a few things about being anxious people I want to talk about. The first thing is that makes us a discontented people. We are, those of us who worry or anxious are discontent. Several years ago, a 14-year-old kid by the name of Jason Lehman wrote a great poem. I want to read it to you. It's called Present Tense. Here's what he wrote. It was spring, but it was summer I wanted. The warm days and the great outdoors. It was summer, but it was fall I wanted. The colorful leaves and the cool dry air. It was fall, but it was winter I wanted. The beautiful snow and the joy of the holiday season. It was winter, but it was spring I wanted. The warmth and the blossoming of nature. I was a child, but it was adulthood I wanted. The freedom and the respect. I was 20, but it was 30 I wanted. To be mature and sophisticated. I was middle-aged, but it was 20 I wanted. The youth and the free spirit. I was retired, but it was middle age I wanted. The presence of mind without limitations. My life was over, but I never got what I wanted. Discontent. Always wanting something you don't have. Always wanting what's on the other side of the fence, the greener grass. How many people have you known that lived that way? I wish I was. I wish this was. If only we could have this. And that is a discontented people that live their life based on anxiety and worry. So those of us who spend our time worrying are certainly discontent. We're also disadvantaged. And I take you now to another list, a list of the products, the results, the outcomes of anxiety according to medical doctors, according to scientists. Here they are. Heart disease, IBS, tension headaches, high blood sugar, Alzheimer's, common cold, obesity, depression, sleep dysfunction, neck and shoulder pain. Harvard researchers a few years ago wrote this: too much stress for too long creates what is known as chronic stress, which has been linked to heart disease, stroke, and may also influence cancer and chronic respiratory diseases. And illness is just the tip of the iceberg. Stress affects you emotionally as well, marring the joy you gain from life and loved ones. So in fact, 90 to 95% of our health problems are directly linked to stress and anxiety. Now think about that. What a disadvantage to living this life. Well over a year ago, I cited a book that I thought was just fascinating. I want to quote from it one more time. The book is Why Zebras Don't Have Ulcers, and it's written by a guy by the name of Robert Sapolsky. He's a professor of neurology and neurological sciences at Stanford, and here's how he explains what he's discovered. He says, for the vast majority of beasts, that is animals, on this planet, stress is about a short-term crisis, after which it's either over with or you're over with. When we sit around and worry about stressful things, we turn on the same physiological responses, but they are potentially a disaster when provoked chronically or continually. A large body of evidence suggests that stress-related disease emerges predominantly out of the fact that we so often activate a physiological system that exists for responding to acute physical emergencies, but we turn it on for months on end, worrying about mortgages, relationships, and promotions. We are certainly discontent, and we're certainly at a disadvantage. The third thing that comes to mind is we're actually delusional. There's a delusional side of worry, and that is well over 90%, probably closer to 100% of the things we worry about will never take place. They will never occur. But we think it's worth our time to stew and think about things that are potentially harmful to us. So I'm saying we're delusional. What's the definition of delusional? It means to have impressions that contradict reality. And that's really what worry is. I have a lot of impressions that really have nothing to do with reality. There's a really interesting book that was written by Clarence Macartney about a guy by the name of Thomas Carlyle. So Thomas Carlyle lived back in the Victorian age, and he had this home. And so the story is about his home. And the description is that he put in this home, again, Carlyle was a historian and a writer, one of the great writers of the Victorian age, but he had it soundproofed so that nothing could distract him, nothing could bother him. What a great idea, right? We're talking about how distractions in this life keep us from doing what we ought to be doing. He made sure his house was such that he would never be distracted, except he had a neighbor right next to him that had a rooster that would crow 3 times during the night, and he couldn't keep that noise from coming in and keeping him from sleeping. He went to his neighbor and complained about it, and the neighbor said, I don't know what the problem is. He only does it 3 times a night. And here is exactly what Carlyle told him. I got to read this to you. You'll relate to it. Carlyle said, but if you only knew what I suffer waiting for that rooster to crow. It's not actually that it's crowing all the time. It's that I'm just waiting for it. There's a phrase in our language that you may have heard before, when the other shoe drops. It comes from the early 1900s when people would live, in apartment buildings, but the barrier between people below and people above was so thin, the way the apartments were built, that someone going to bed could actually hear someone else going to bed drop their shoe on the floor, and then there would be a time where they'd be waiting for the other shoe to drop. In other words, it's this anticipation. It's driving me crazy. Back in 1994, my parents lived in the San Fernando Valley of California. We lived in Tucson, Arizona, and there was that huge earthquake. It was like a 6.5 magnitude earthquake, something like that. It happened early in the morning. It lasted like 20 seconds. Well, I couldn't get a hold of my parents. And from the footage from the television, we recognized the things that were falling apart right around where my parents lived. We got in our car, took our kids with us, and drove over to the San Fernando Valley. We had to maze our way into where their house was because so many streets were blocked off and closed. All the windows were broken in all the storefronts. We finally got there just to make sure my parents were okay. They were okay. But we all decided we should probably stay outside in a tent in case there's another huge aftershock. During that night, I did not sleep a wink because I was just waiting for another aftershock. I mean, they happened periodically, but I couldn't sleep. It wasn't the aftershock that scared me. It was, when's the next one coming? It's that idea that we lose total perspective when we're anxious, waiting for the next shoe to drop, waiting for what's about to happen to us. So we come back now to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6, verse 26 now. And Jesus says, look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Couple things about this. Obviously, he's teaching outside, which I absolutely loved about the teaching of Jesus. He taught inside sometimes, but he was often outside. That's why we choose outside settings as often as we can, because that was just the way he taught. He looked around, and no doubt he saw some birds and said, look at those birds. Thus our setting here. I don't know if they're still behind us, but there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of geese on what is called Confluence Park and this lake here. Confluence because 2 rivers come together right here next to us, the Uncompahgre and the Gunnison. Down the road a bit, they'll combine with the Colorado, a 1,400-mile river that spans 7 states and 2 Mexican states, starts up in Granby, Colorado. It all kind of begins right here, a confluence of waters, but geese love to hang out here. Look at these geese. Do they look worried, is my question. Have you ever seen a goose pacing back and forth real fast, biting its fingernails? Jesus' point is obvious, isn't it? Now Jesus goes on in verse 27, can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? Jesus does something really cool here. He uses a phrase that can mean 2 things. Can you add a single hour to your life? Which we would say, well, yeah, we can. We can exercise and we can but he knows the truth. You can't add a single hour to your life. I've already decided when your life will end here on earth. You can't add a single hour. And we really think Jesus is wrong about that. But the phrase also means can add a single cubit, that is, inches or a foot, close to a foot, can add a single cubit to your height. The phrase means both. In my mind, of course, you know where I go. I think Jesus was extraordinarily short. And I think he said this with a smile on his face. That's the Jesus I really believe we miss. But his point is, what can you do about the things in life that are the way they are? Why do you spend so much time trying to change the way things are? There are some things that can change. Our heart can change, right? And some other things can happen. I can make a relationship healthier, but I am not going to change the weather. I am not going to change the length of my life. And the thought that I can do that tells me one thing is that I'm delusional. I think I'm God. He goes on, verse 28. And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow? They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. Okay, so the birds and the flowers. He takes two very natural things that we see all the time, and he says, let me show you how this works. My Father created these things, these birds, these geese, the trees you see. My Father put these in place, and he cares about them, but he cares so much more for you. I'm so tempted to go off on a tangent here about the huge difference between the other things God created and us, those he put his image in. And he says he cares so much more for you because his image is in us. And so for us to try to make those things equal, like this planet, animals, the same as humans. Okay, did I go off on a tangent? I think so. But the point is, Jesus is saying you are so much more valuable. Don't you understand that you don't have to be concerned about the things you're concerned about because God cares more than you do? Okay, now to finish this section, I want to do something a little different. I want to transition and talk for a minute about nicknames. All right, what's a nickname? The dictionary actually says a nickname is a familiar or humorous name given to a person or thing instead of or as well as their real name. Okay, a humorous name that's given to you. I was given a humorous name or an interesting name in high school by one of my football coaches. He was also a leader of our FCA group, and he gave me a name that started with an S and ended in a Y, and it's not Shorty. Christy had a name given to her when she was in high school, Muscles Beach, because her last name was Beach, and I guess she had some serious guns. She still does. She has serious guns. Okay. So she was given that nickname. All right, so nicknames. Let's talk about nicknames for just a second because it's going to come into play here in a moment. So I'm going to throw out a series of nicknames to you. I'll leave a space here to see if you can finish the nickname. And in part, we'll also see whose nicknames they are, maybe, for some of them. Ivan the Terrible. Jack the Ripper. The Zodiac Killer. Dr. Death. Kevorkian. I don't see the humor in those nicknames, do you? Let's do a couple more here. The Wolf. Do you know who the Wolf was? Adolf Hitler. That was his favorite name for himself. That's why the place he kind of tended to hide out was the Wolf's Lair. All right, the Wolf, and it's a good name for him. How about the Babe? George Herman Ruth, right? How about Scarface? No, not Al Pacino. Al Capone. All right, all these are nicknames. They all mean something. All right, they're not the original name, but they have meaning. What's in a nickname? Well, in a lot of nicknames, there's some truth in those nicknames that are given. And again, some of them are fun. Now Jesus is going to do something remarkable. All right, here we go. Verse 30. If that is how, he's talking about the birds and the flowers and the trees and how God cares about these. If that's how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow's thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? You know what that phrase is? That's great. That's a nickname. Jesus has used a nickname. You won't find anyone else or anything place else in the New Testament that uses that phrase. You have little faith. He gives them a nickname. We've told you before that the word pisteuo means belief or trust. There's an even better word that goes with it, confidence. Confidence. So when pisteuo is used, those who believe in the Son of God, those who place their confidence in the Son of God, he says that's the goal. Place your confidence in God. So he's making this point, right? Why aren't you placing more confidence in God? Why do you think you have to take control of everything and play God? Like Martha, become the fourth member of the Trinity, okay? Question for you. If Jesus was giving you a nickname, what do you think it would be? The phrase Jesus is using here is oligopistos, which means little faith. It's a phrase that he invented for his disciples. Let's call the nickname Tiny Trusts. How about that? Tiny Trusts. You tiny trusts. That's what he's saying. You have so little trust, confidence in me. Now, he does this 4 times. It's recorded 5 times. Let me give you the examples. Here we go. Matthew 6:30 is where we're at. Then there's Matthew 8:26, where Jesus is woken up in the middle of a storm in a boat, and they're saying, we're going to die. And he says, oh, you oligopistos. Oh, you tiny trusts. And obviously we know he gets up and calms the sea. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 31, again, they're out on the water, and Peter gets out of the boat, says, can I walk to you, Jesus? He says, go for it. He gets out, takes a step, and sees the wind, and sinks, and reaches up and says, help me! And Jesus reaches down, grabs him, and says, oh, you oligopistos. Yo, you tiny truster. And then finally, in Matthew 17:20, his disciples are unable to cast a demon out of a boy, and they say, why can't we do that when Jesus had no problem doing it? Guess what he does? He uses his favorite nickname for his disciples, oligopistos. Oh, you tiny trusters. You just have such tiny trust. Your confidence is so minute in what God can do, in what I can do. And then it's recorded again in Luke 12:20. That is another place where the Sermon on the Mount is found, so it's the same time. But there are 4 times, count them, 4 times, Jesus gives them the same nickname over and over again. What's in a nickname? Sometimes they're funny. Is this a funny nickname? I think he's actually chiding them. I really do. You say, oh, Jesus was so straight-laced, he never smiled. He would never chide anybody. No, he's hilarious. And he keeps using the same phrase, and they must keep going, oh, there it is again. You know, I've got the same, he's using the same nickname for us. It's a big deal. The question is, would he have that nickname for you and for me? Would he say, you're such a tiny truster? Not a tiny person, but your trust is so tiny. You have such little faith. In that passage I mentioned where Jesus tells them why they couldn't cast the demon out of the boy, he then goes into a teaching about us having the confidence in him, the faith in him, like a mustard seed. Just that much would move a mountain. He says if you just had that much, look how tiny that is. See the play on words, see the fun Jesus is having with them in addressing a real serious issue. And it's our serious issue as well. Our tiny trust leads to anxiety. Our tiny faith leads to worry. In fact, this is a sin that we must begin to deal with. Number 1, life would become so much better, but number 2, and more importantly, then we're connecting in reality with God at a deeper level, at a level of truth about who he is. Final discussion question for you. In what areas of your life do you exhibit great trust and confidence in God? And in what areas of your life do you exhibit very little trust and confidence in God? So let's wrap this up with verses 31 and 32. Jesus again reiterates it in case they missed it, in case you and I missed it. Do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? What shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. He says, why would you do what pagans do? Why would you act, behave, and think? I think the geese are not worried. I think they're just saying, we agree. Why would you live like a pagan, Jesus says? Do you see how pointed his teaching is? This really demands a response. The question is, why would you act like pagans when you know me? When you know the Father? He says, why would you ask those questions? Again, for us, we go, well, I don't ask the question what I'm going to wear. I know what I'm going to wear tomorrow, or I'll figure it out. So what is it we have here? We have a symptom and we have a real problem. The symptom is worry. All right? Do not worry. Pay attention to the symptoms of your real problem, Jesus says. The problem is to be disconnected in your trust and confidence in God. To be distracted and disengaged from God. That's a problem. And that's the issue. And that's why earlier he said in the lesson last week we talked about, you cannot serve both God and money. Money, if you're serving it, will distract you and disengage you from God, because you'll begin to put your confidence and your focus in those things instead of God alone. That's the problem. When my focus is not on doing life with God and God alone, and one of the symptoms of that is I become so distracted and fall apart at the seams, and that I become a person who worries all the time. There's a book that was written 80 years ago, and I hope you've had the chance to read it. If you haven't, you ought to read it. It's from C.S. Lewis. It was written in 1941 during World War II, and it's called The Screwtape Letters. And in this book, the premise of the book is this. What a unique and creative thing C.S. Lewis did. There's a guy by the name of Screwtape. He's not a guy, he's a demon. He's a leader of the demons. And he is mentoring his nephew named Wormwood. Okay? So you got Screwtape, kind of the head demon, mentoring his nephew, a minion of a demon, Wormwood. And then they refer to the enemy, and that's obviously God. And they refer to the patient, and that's the man that Wormwood is trying to pull from God. Okay? So that's the setting. And here's what Screwtape writes to Wormwood. You will say that these are very small sins. And doubtless, like all young tempters, you are anxious to be able to report spectacular wickedness. In other words, you'd like to lead your patient, your man, into witchcraft. He says, yeah, I know you'd like to do that. But do remember, the only thing that matters is the extent to which you separate the man from the enemy. Remember who the enemy is. He says this is all that matters. He doesn't have to be into Satanism. He just has to be distracted apart from the enemy who is God. It does not matter how small the sins are, provided that their cumulative effect is to edge the man away from the light and out into nothing. Murder is no better than cards if cards can do the trick. Okay, so back in that day, the church was really concerned about people playing cards. And so he's saying, murder, cards, it doesn't matter if the goal is met, and that is to pull us away from Satan's enemy. All right? So instead of cards, put in worry. Let me say it again, that reading worry into it. Murder is no better than worry. Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turns, without milestones, without signposts. And then he signs this letter to his minion nephew, your affectionate Uncle Screwtape. Have you ever thought of a demon as being affectionate? Isn't that great stuff? He says, it doesn't have to be a big deal. You don't have to get people to murder and rape and commit adultery. You don't have to do that, he says to Wormwood. Just get them to do something that's hardly noticeable, like worry. And that will disengage, that will distract and pull them from the light, the enemy, as far as they are concerned. So what will counteract worry? Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it, from Jesus? It's confidence. And we're going to go further into that in the next lesson as he concludes this little section on worry, that we must replace it. So we've done the recognition part. We can now recognize what it is that is pulling us, distracting us from God, and why our lives seem to be in such turmoil. We recognize that now. Next we'll go into how do we replace it. With what do we replace worry? So let's finish with this story of a farmer who had 3 sows, and he really wanted them to reproduce. And so he knew of a farmer down the road a couple miles who had some boars. And so he said, can we get them together, and and we'll figure out the details later as far as who gets the little piglets. And so they agreed to do that. So he loads them in the truck and he takes them down to the farmer down the road, and they're kind of, talking and hoping things go well. And he happens to ask the other farmer, he says, now how will I know if this took? And the farmer goes, well, if they go home and they wallow in the grass, it took. If they wallow in the mud, it didn't take. So he takes them home, and much to his chagrin, they wallow in the grass. So he loads them back up in the truck and takes them back there another couple days. And each time he comes back, and sure enough, they're wallowing in the grass. And he's getting a little upset about it, a little concerned about it. Will this ever happen? On about the 4th day, he had to go out of town for a day. And so he was wondering if maybe anything had changed. So he called back to his wife and he said, hey, can you tell me, are the sows, are they wallowing in the mud or in the grass? And her response was, well, neither actually. 2 of them are in the back of the truck and the other one's honking the horn in the front seat. So the point of, what's the moral of that story? Be a pig. That's what the moral of the story is. The farmer is filled with anxiousness over something he can't control, and the pigs are just enjoying life. All right, so in the midst of so many things, I started with a list of 10, there's a list of hundreds, things to be anxious about, things to worry about. I implore you, I beg you to be obedient to the words of Jesus. Remove anxiety by placing confidence in Him, that He's got it all under control. Enjoy the life He has for you. Certainly care for others, care about God's will, and we'll get into that in the next lesson. Thanks for joining us, joining all of us, my feathered friends here at Confluence Park. How perfect is that? They're not worried about a thing. God's taking care of them. He cares so much more for you and for me. God bless.